The shared iPad on the granite island lit up with a notification. Voice memo synced from Sarah's iPhone. Consultation with Dr. Aris. Mark, expecting a diagnosis for her recent pains, pressed play, but the audio wasn't clinical. It was the distinct snap of latex gloves followed by a wet, rhythmic sound, and Sarah's breathless whisper, "Make me forget him, doctor." Mark paused the recording, the silence in the kitchen suddenly deafening against the hum of the refrigerator. He didn't scream. He simply placed his wedding band on top of the screen, right over the play button, and walked out the front door, leaving it wide open to the storm outside. If the silence of a truth revealed cuts deeper than a scream. Stay with me. The kitchen was spotless, a testament to the order Mark Vance craved in a world of chaotic variables. It was 6:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Seattle penthouse, blurring the city lights into streaks of gray and gold. Mark was chopping vegetables, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the knife against the bamboo board serving as his meditation. On the marble island, the household iPad sat propped up on its stand. It was usually reserved for recipes or jazz playlists, but tonight, the screen pulsed with a blue notification light. iCloud sync complete. One new voice memo. Mark wiped his hands on a towel. He frowned. Sarah wasn't tech-savvy. She rarely recorded voice memos unless it was a reminder for her grocery list or notes for her interior design clients. The file name, however, was auto-generated by location, Medical Arts Building, Suite 404. Suite 404, Mark muttered. That was Dr. Aris's office. Sarah had an appointment today for her endometriosis checkup. She had come home flustered, claiming the traffic was a nightmare, and had gone straight to a bath. Concern pricked at Mark. Had the doctor given her bad news? Did she record the consultation to remember the medical jargon? He tapped the screen. The audio began with the rustling of fabric, the sound of a heavy door clicking shut. Then, the distinct, squeaking roll of a doctor's stool. "How is the pain, Sarah?" The voice was smooth, baritone. Dr. Aris. "It hurts," Sarah's voice replied, but the tone wasn't one of suffering. It was breathy, low. "But not where you're looking." Mark froze. The knife lay forgotten on the cutting board. "We have 20 minutes before my next patient," Aris said. The sound of a metal buckle clinking echoed through the speaker. "Your husband? Where is he?" "He thinks I'm getting an ultrasound." Sarah let out a soft, degrading giggle that made Mark's stomach turn to lead. "He's so stupid, Julian. He works so hard to pay for this insurance, and I use it to see you." Then came the sounds that would haunt Mark for the rest of his life. The wet, visceral noise of intimacy mixed with the clinical snap of latex gloves. The groans. The absolute lack of hesitation. Mark didn't scream. He didn't throw the iPad across the room. The structural engineer in him took over, assessing the damage, realizing the structural integrity of this home, this marriage, was compromised beyond repair. Collapse was imminent. The only safety protocol was immediate evacuation. He pressed stop. He looked up at the ceiling. The master bath was directly above the kitchen. He could hear the faint rumble of the jacuzzi jets. She was up there, washing off the afternoon, preparing to come down and eat the dinner he was cooking. Mark walked to the hallway closet. He didn't pack a suitcase. Suitcases were for trips, and trips implied a return. He took his waterproof duffel bag. Into it went his laptop, his passport, his hard drive, and the singular framed photo of his late mother from the mantel. He went to the smart home hub on the wall. With calm, deliberate fingers, he deleted his user profile. He removed his credit card from the shared Amazon account. He transferred the liquid funds from their joint checking to his private savings, exactly 50%, down to the cent. He returned to the kitchen. The iPad screen had gone dark. Mark slid his platinum wedding band off his finger. He placed it gently on the cold marble counter, directly on top of the iPad. The metal made a hollow clink. He walked to the front door. He didn't look back at the living room, the expensive sofa they had picked out together, or the life he had spent 7 years building. He opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the pouring rain. He didn't close the door behind him. He left it wide open, letting the wind and the rain blow into the pristine foyer, letting the storm inside the house match the one he was walking into. Mark got into his car, backed out of the driveway, and drove toward the interstate without turning on his headlights. Mark checked into the Motel 6 near SeaTac Airport 40 minutes later. The room smelled of stale lemon cleaner and damp carpet. It was a violent shift from the heated floors and Italian marble of the penthouse. But Mark found the sterility comforting. It felt like a clean slate. He sat at the small, wobbly desk and opened his laptop. The screen's glow illuminated his face, casting deep shadows under his eyes. He didn't look like a man who had just lost his wife. He looked like an engineer staring at a blueprint for a demolition. He logged into their primary banking portal. His fingers moved with practiced speed. He transferred his entire paycheck savings, money that was legally his prior to the marriage, into a secure external account he had opened years ago for emergency contracting work. Then, he froze the joint credit cards. Not canceled, but suspended for security concerns. Next, he drafted an email to Elias Thorne. Thorne was not a family lawyer. He was a corporate litigator known for hostile takeovers. They had played squash together twice. Mark knew Thorne didn't negotiate. He annihilated. Subject: representation required immediately. Message: irreconcilable differences. Adultery with documented proof. I want full severance. I want the house listed by Monday. I am unreachable to her. Mark hit send, closed the laptop, and lay down on the stiff mattress fully clothed. He stared at the water stain on the ceiling, waiting for the inevitable dawn. Back at the penthouse, the wind had blown rain halfway into the foyer before Sarah came downstairs. She was wrapped in a plush white robe, her skin flushed from the heat of the bath, humming a tune she had heard in Dr. Aris's office. "Mark?" she called out, annoyed. "Did you leave the door open? It's freezing." She stepped into a puddle of water on the hardwood. She scowled, reaching to slam the heavy door shut. That was when she saw the kitchen island. The iPad was dark. The platinum ring sat on top of it, cold and dull in the ambient light. Sarah froze. Her heart gave a singular, painful thump against her ribs. She picked up the ring. It felt lighter than she remembered. She tapped the iPad screen. The file Medical Arts Building was still displayed. She didn't press play. She didn't need to. The blood drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling, but panic didn't set in immediately. Indignation did. "Dramatic," she whispered, her voice shaking with anger rather than remorse. She tossed the ring onto the counter. He had heard. So what? He would sulk. He would drive around for a few hours, maybe sleep in his car, and come back begging for an explanation. He always did. He needed her chaos to balance his order. She poured herself a glass of wine, ignoring the knot in her stomach, and went to bed alone. The next morning, the reality of the ghost protocol made landfall. Sarah woke up late. The other side of the bed was untouched. The house was silent. No smell of coffee, no sound of the news. She dressed quickly, deciding she would treat herself to a luxury breakfast at Le Rêve before calling Julian to complain about Mark's immaturity. She drove to the cafe, ordered a latte and a truffle croissant, and sat by the window. She texted Mark, "Stop acting like a child. Come home so we can talk." The message turned green, not blue. He had blocked her on iMessage. She tried calling. It went straight to voicemail without a single ring. A server in a crisp black apron approached her table, holding a small card reader. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance," the girl said, lowering her voice discreetly. "Your card was declined." Sarah laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "That's impossible. Try it again. It's a black Amex." "I did, ma'am, 3 times. It says card suspended by primary account holder." The cafe suddenly felt very small and very hot. People at nearby tables seemed to be watching. Sarah pulled out her debit card, the one linked to their joint checking. "Try this one," she snapped, her hand shaking slightly. The server returned 10 seconds later, looking pitying. "Insufficient funds, ma'am. The balance is 0. Sarah stared at the plastic card in her hand. It wasn't just a piece of plastic anymore. It was a severed lifeline. For the first time, the silence from Mark didn't feel like a sulk. It felt like a sentence. Panic is a strange fuel. For Sarah, it burned quickly into a manic sort of optimism. Driving back from the cafe, the initial shock of the declined card faded, replaced by a defiant narrative she was already constructing in her head. Mark was controlling. Mark was financially abusive. This wasn't abandonment. It was an escape hatch she hadn't been brave enough to open herself. She parked her Audi in the driveway. At least she still had the car, and looked at her phone. Still no service from Mark. No angry texts, no demands for an apology. Just a void. "Fine," she said aloud to the empty dashboard. "If he wants to play games, I'll play for keeps." She didn't go inside to pack. She didn't call her parents. She drove straight to the medical arts building. She needed validation. She needed Julian to tell her that this was fate, that they could finally stop whispering in exam rooms and start living. She bypassed the receptionist, flashing a smile that was too bright, too brittle. She knew Julian's schedule. He had a lunch break at noon. It was 12:15. She knocked once on the heavy oak door of Suite 404 and slipped inside without waiting for an answer. Dr. Aris was sitting at his mahogany desk, reviewing a patient file while eating a salad from a plastic container. He looked up, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. He didn't smile. His eyes, usually warm and heavy with suggestion, were flat. "Sarah," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was a statement of inconvenience. "I have patients in the waiting room. You can't just walk in here." "He knows, Julian," Sarah blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. She walked around the desk, reaching for his hand, but he didn't reach back. "Mark knows. He heard us. He left." Julian slowly set his fork down. The silence that stretched between them was not the comfortable, charged silence of their affair. It was the silence of a man calculating risk. "What do you mean he heard us?" Julian asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I think the iPad synced." "It doesn't matter," she said quickly, trying to brush past the details to get to the romance. "He moved out. He froze the accounts. It's over, Julian. I'm free. We don't have to hide anymore." She waited for him to stand up, to pull her into an embrace, to tell her they would figure it out together. Julian didn't stand. He leaned back in his leather chair, looking at her with the same clinical detachment he used when reading a biopsy report. "He froze the accounts?" Julian repeated. So you have no access to funds? Sarah blinked, confused by his focus. For now. But the divorce settlement. Divorce settlements take years, Sarah, especially when there's proof of adultery. Julian cut her off. He stood up then, but he didn't move toward her. He walked to the window, looking down at the street. You need to leave. Sarah felt a cold prickle at the base of her neck. What? Julian, did you hear me? I said I'm leaving him for you. Julian turned around. The mask was completely off now. You aren't leaving him for me. You got caught. There is a difference. He adjusted his white coat, smoothing a wrinkle. I run a practice here. My reputation is everything. If your husband has a recording, if he decides to make this public, you are a liability, Sarah. A liability. The word tasted like ash in her mouth. Yesterday you said I was the only thing that made this city bearable. That was yesterday, Julian said, checking his watch. When you were a bored, wealthy housewife with a discreet life. Now you're a scandal waiting to happen. I can't be part of your mess. He walked to the door and held it open. The hallway light spilled in, harsh and unforgiving. Go home, Sarah. Call a lawyer. And do not come back here without an appointment. Sarah stood there, her hands trembling by her sides. The man looking at her wasn't the passionate lover who whispered promises against her skin. He was a doctor dismissing a difficult case. She walked out of the office, past the curious eyes of the nurses, and into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, severing her view of Suite 404, the manic optimism shattered. She was alone in a steel box, going down. 3 weeks later, 3,000 miles away, Mark Vance was no longer an engineer. He was just a pair of hands. He had rented a drafty, shingled cottage on the outskirts of Rockland, Maine. The air here didn't smell like designer coffee and exhaust. It smelled of brine, pine needles, and low tide. Mark had taken a cash job helping a local contractor repair storm-damaged piers. It was brutal, repetitive work that left his muscles screaming and his knuckles raw. But it was the only thing that allowed him to sleep. He stood on the edge of a weathered dock, drilling galvanized bolts into heavy oak beams. The vibration of the drill traveled up his arm, shaking loose the phantom sensation of the iPad screen under his fingertips. Here, nobody knew he was a cuckold. Nobody knew he was a high-profile structural consultant. To the locals, he was just Mac, a quiet guy from the West Coast who worked hard and didn't ask questions. His phone, a cheap burner he'd bought at a gas station, buzzed in his pocket. It was Elias Thorne. The asset freeze is contesting nicely. Thorne's voice was crisp, cutting through the sound of seagulls. Her legal team is claiming financial abandonment. I sent them the recording. They went quiet very quickly. We're moving to the next phase. Good, Mark said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve. Keep pressing. He hung up. He didn't ask how Sarah was. He picked up the next beam, the weight of it grounding him in reality. In Seattle, reality was dissolving for Sarah. The social exile hadn't been an explosion. It was a slow, suffocating gas leak. It started with unreturned texts. Then, the polite declines to her dinner party invitations. But today, the facade finally cracked wide open. Sarah stood in the lobby of her exclusive yoga studio, the one where she had spent years cultivating friendships with the wives of tech moguls and venture capitalists. She tapped her membership card on the scanner. It beeped red. Access denied. The girl at the front desk, a 20-year-old with perfect skin who usually greeted Sarah by name, didn't look up. She typed something on her keyboard, her posture rigid. There must be a mistake. Sarah said, forcing a laugh. "It's me, Courtney. Try it again." Courtney finally looked up. Her eyes weren't friendly. They were filled with a mix of curiosity and disgust, the kind of look one gives a car wreck. "It's not a mistake, Mrs. Vance. The board reviewed the membership clause regarding conduct detrimental to the community's reputation." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Conduct? What are you talking about?" "Please don't make a scene." Courtney lowered her voice, leaning in. "Jennifer told everyone. About the doctor. About the recording." The name hit Sarah like a physical slap. Jennifer was supposed to be her best friend. Sarah had called her the night Mark left, crying, spinning a story about Mark having a midlife crisis. She hadn't mentioned the affair, but Mark must have, or the lawyers, or maybe, just maybe, the walls of this city were thinner than she thought. "That's slander," Sarah hissed, clutching her yoga mat. "Is it?" A voice came from behind her. Sarah turned. It was Linda, the wife of Mark's boss. Linda was holding a green juice, looking at Sarah with absolute coldness. "Mark designed the foundation of my house, Sarah. He's a good man," Linda said, her voice loud enough to silence the lobby. "And Dr. Aris delivered my sister's baby. Do you have any idea how sick you look to us right now? Sleeping with the man who treats you." The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on Sarah. It wasn't the admiration she used to crave. It was judgment, pure, unfiltered social execution. Sarah backed away, her hands shaking. She turned and pushed through the glass doors, stumbling out onto the sidewalk. The gray Seattle sky seemed to press down on her. She reached for her phone to call Julian, to tell him they were attacking her, but stopped. "You are a liability." His words echoed in her mind. She stood on the corner of 4th and Pike, surrounded by thousands of people, and realized she had never been more alone. The pain didn't come as a sharp stab. It arrived like a rising tide, heavy and sickeningly warm. It was 3 a.m. on a Thursday. Sarah lay curled in the fetal position on the master bed, sheets tangled around her legs. Her skin was clammy, coated in a cold sweat that smelled metallic. 3 days ago, before the exile from the yoga studio, she had seen Julian for a routine follow-up procedure. A deep tissue biopsy he claimed was necessary to monitor her endometriosis. He had been distracted during the procedure, rushing to finish before his nurse returned from lunch. Now, her lower abdomen felt like it was filled with broken glass. She tried to stand, but a wave of nausea buckled her knees. She crawled to the bathroom, vomiting bile into the pristine porcelain toilet. When she wiped her mouth, her hand was trembling so violently she couldn't focus on her own reflection. She needed a doctor. But she couldn't go to the ER. The shame was too fresh. She felt like the letter A was branded on her forehead. If she went to the hospital, they would call her primary gynecologist, Julian. She grabbed her phone and dialed his private number. It rang 4 times. 5. "What?" His voice was groggy, irritated. "Julian," she gasped, gripping the edge of the sink. "Something's wrong. It burns. I think I have a fever. The incision site feels hard." There was a pause on the line. No concern, just the rustle of sheets. "It's 3 a.m., Sarah. I know, I'm sorry. But it hurts so much. You need to see me, please." "I can't see you," he snapped. "I told you, you're a liability right now. If you come to the office looking like a wreck, people will talk." "I don't care about people," she screamed, the sound tearing at her throat. "I'm sick, Julian. You did this procedure. You have to fix it." A long silence followed. Then his voice changed. It became the smooth, condescending tone he used on difficult patients. "Sarah, listen to me. You're under a tremendous amount of stress. Mark left you. You're being ostracized. This pain, it's psychosomatic. It's your guilt manifesting as physical symptoms. It's called conversion disorder." "It's not in my head," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I'm bleeding, Julian." "Spotting is normal," he dismissed her. "Look, take 2 Xanax and sleep it off. If you go to the ER hysterically claiming I botched a simple biopsy, you'll look unstable. Do you want Mark to use that against you in court? Do you want to be labeled unfit?" The threat hung in the air, precise and paralyzing. He was using her divorce against her. He was using her vulnerability to shield his malpractice. "You won't help me," she whispered, disbelief overriding the pain. "I'm helping you. I'm telling you to calm down and stop acting crazy. Don't call this number again tonight." The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone. It clattered against the tile floor. The silence of the house rushed back in, louder than before. She sat on the cold floor of the bathroom, clutching her stomach. The man she had destroyed her marriage for wasn't coming. He had diagnosed her pain as madness to save his own skin. A fresh wave of agony seized her, doubling her over. She realized then, with terrifying clarity, that she could die here. She could die on this bathroom floor, in this empty multi-million-dollar penthouse, and Julian would probably be relieved. She reached for the phone again. Her fingers hovered over 911, but shame stayed her hand. Instead, she scrolled down to the one contact she hadn't deleted, the one she had ignored for weeks. "Mom." She pressed call, sobbing into the receiver as soon as the line connected. "Mom, please. I hurt. He won't help me. I think I'm dying." For the first time since the affair began, Sarah wasn't the protagonist of a romance novel. She was just a frightened child who had played with fire and was finally, truly burning. The Atlantic Ocean looked different than the Pacific. It was darker, colder, and moved with a violence that Mark found strangely calming. He sat at the small wooden table in his rental cottage, the remnants of a microwave dinner pushed to the side. Outside, a nor'easter was battering the coast of Maine, rattling the window panes. On his laptop screen, a secure file transfer bar reached 100%. Elias Thorne had been thorough. Mark had asked for dirt on Julian Aris to expedite the divorce settlement, to prove Aris was a predator, ensuring Sarah got nothing. But what the private investigator had unearthed wasn't just leverage, it was a crime scene. Mark opened the folder titled J. Aris Background Redacted PDF. The first document was a non-disclosure agreement from 5 years ago. A patient named Elena Rostova. She had settled out of court for an undisclosed sum following a surgical complication. Mark scrolled down to the investigator's notes attached to the file. Subject Elena Rostova committed suicide 6 months after the settlement. Family claimed she was having an affair with Aris. Medical records indicate a perforated bowel during a routine laparoscopy. Aris claimed it was a known risk. No autopsy performed due to settlement terms. Mark's jaw tightened. He clicked the next file. Patient, Clara D. Year, 2021. Complaint, sexual misconduct under sedation. Result, dismissed due to lack of evidence. Patient diagnosed with borderline personality disorder by a psychiatrist referred by Dr. Julian Aris. The pattern was unmistakable. It was an engineering blueprint for destruction. Aris didn't just sleep with his patients. He targeted women who were emotionally vulnerable or medically dependent. He seduced them, and when the medical lines blurred and mistakes were made, he used their psychological fragility to discredit them. He broke them before they could speak. Mark stood up and walked to the window. He saw his own reflection in the dark glass, a man who had successfully erased himself. He was free. He had his money. He had his dignity. Sarah was no longer his problem. If she was suffering, it was a consequence of her own calculus. But Mark was an engineer. His entire life was dedicated to the principle that you do not ignore a structural crack. If you see a load-bearing wall buckling, you don't walk away because it's not your building anymore. You condemn it before it collapses on everyone inside. His phone buzzed. It was Thorne. "You read it?" Thorne asked. "I read it," Mark replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's ugly, Mark, but strictly speaking, it's not our fight. We can use the threat of releasing this to force Sarah into a quick settlement. Aris will pressure her to sign anything to keep this quiet. You can be fully divorced in a month." "And then what?" Mark asked. "He finds another Sarah? That's not your concern. You want it out. This is the fastest way out." Mark looked back at the laptop screen. He thought of the audio recording, the wet, sickening sound of Aris's indifference. He thought of Sarah's voice, breathy and delusional. She was weak, yes. She was a traitor, yes. But she was currently in the hands of a man who buried his mistakes. Mark remembered the look in Sarah's eyes the last time he saw her. Not the lust, but the underlying desperation to be seen. Aris had weaponized that. "No," Mark said. The decision settled in his chest, heavy and cold like a stone. "We don't settle." "Mark, listen to me. I'm not doing this for her, Elias. I'm doing this because he's a hazard. You don't negotiate with cancer. You cut it out." Mark walked over to the table and closed the laptop with a definitive snap. "Book me a flight to Seattle and subpoena the records for Elena Rostova. We're going to depose him. Mark, if you come back, you lose the anonymity. You get dragged into the mud." "I know," Mark said, reaching for his duffel bag. He picked up the framed photo of his mother and placed it carefully inside. "But I'm not coming back as a husband. I'm coming back as a witness." He ended the call. The wind howled outside. But inside the cottage, the silence was finally broken by the sound of a zipper closing. The ghost protocol was over. It was time for the demolition. The conference room on the 42nd floor of the Thorne & Associates building overlooked the Puget Sound. It was a gray, steel-colored day, matching the mood inside the glass walls. Sarah sat at the far end of the long mahogany table. She looked like a ghost of the woman who had smirked in the gynecologist's chair weeks ago. She had lost 15 pounds. Her skin was sallow, and she shifted uncomfortably in her seat, wincing from the lingering pain of an infection that antibiotics were barely keeping at bay. Her mother sat beside her, holding her hand, glaring at the empty chair opposite them. Dr. Julian Aris sat across from her. He was dressed in a three-piece suit, checking his watch with theatrical impatience. He leaned over to his attorney. "This is harassment," Aris whispered loud enough for the room to hear. "The husband is bitter. Let's get this over with so I can get back to my patients." Then, the heavy double doors opened. Mark walked in. He didn't look like the man Sarah remembered. The softness around his jaw was gone, replaced by a rugged, weathered leanness. His hands, resting on the back of the leather chair, were scarred and calloused from the manual labor in Maine. He carried himself with a terrifying stillness. Sarah's breath hitched. "Mark," she whispered. He didn't blink. He didn't turn his head. He didn't even pause. He walked past her as if she were a piece of office furniture, pulled out his chair, and sat down next to Elias Thorne. "Let the record show Mr. Vance is present," the court reporter droned. Let's cut to the chase, Aris's lawyer announced. My client admits to the affair. We are willing to concede on the grounds of adultery to expedite the divorce. Mr. Vance can have the house. Dr. Aris just wants this file closed. Aris looked at Mark, a smug smile touching his lips. I'm sorry for your loss, Mark, but marriages fail. It's hardly a reason to drag us all here. Mark finally looked up. He didn't look at Aris's face. He looked at the doctor's hands, the hands that had touched his wife, the hands that had ruined lives. We aren't here about the marriage, Mark said. His voice was gravelly, unused to speaking in boardrooms anymore. Elias Thorne slid a thick binder across the polished table. It stopped inches from Aris's hands. The cover was labeled Rostova, Daniels, Vance. We are here, Thorne said, his voice dropping to a predatory purr, to discuss your pattern of prescribing heavy sedatives to female patients immediately prior to sexual initiation, and your subsequent falsification of their medical records to discredit them as psychologically unstable when complications arose. The air left the room. Aris's smug smile vanished. He stared at the name Rostova. That was settled. You can't bring that up. We aren't bringing up the settlement, Mark said, locking eyes with Aris. We are bringing up the audio file from my wife's appointment, the one where you dismissed her pain as psychosomatic, just like you did with Elena Rostova 3 days before her bowel perforated. Sarah gasped. She pulled her hand away from her mother, staring at Julian. What? She choked out. Julian, you said it was in my head. Shut up, Sarah, Aris hissed, his facade crumbling instantly into panic. Dr. Aris, Thorne interrupted, opening the binder to reveal a timeline graphic. We have subpoenaed your prescription logs. They match the dates of Mrs. Vance's treatments. You drugged her to make her compliant, didn't you? Just like the others. Mark sat back. He watched the destruction unfold with the detachment of an engineer watching a controlled demolition. He saw Aris sweating, shouting at his lawyer. He saw Sarah crumbling, realizing that her great romance was nothing more than a predator finding a weak target. She wasn't a lover. She was a victim in a lineup. She looked across the table, desperate for a lifeline. Mark, she sobbed, reaching out a trembling hand. Mark, please, I didn't know. Help me. Mark stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He looked at the court reporter, then at Thorne. I think you have everything you need, Mark said. He turned and walked toward the door. Mark! Sarah screamed, trying to stand up but collapsing back into her chair in pain. Don't leave me here with him. Mark! Mark didn't stop. He walked out of the conference room and let the heavy doors seal shut behind him, cutting off her voice as effectively as a mute button. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and waited. He felt absolutely nothing. The fall of Dr. Julian Aris was not the romantic tragedy Sarah had imagined in her darker moments. It was a bureaucratic slaughter. Within 48 hours of the deposition, the state medical board suspended his license pending a criminal investigation into the death of Elena Rostova. The local news vans camped out in front of the medical arts building, hungry for the story of the Svengali gynecologist. Sarah watched it all from the window of a small, furnished apartment her mother had rented for her. She wasn't the tragic heroine of the story. To the public, she was the patient zero of the scandal, the wealthy wife who had opened the door for a predator. When she tried to contact Julian one last time, desperate for an apology or closure, his lawyer threatened her with a restraining order. Julian had released a statement claiming he was the victim of a sedentary housewife's obsession. He didn't love her. He barely liked her. She had just been the most convenient body in the room. 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday that mirrored the gray gloom of the day Mark left, the divorce was finalized. Mark stood on the steps of the King County Courthouse. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, a stark contrast to the suits swarming around him. He held a single manila envelope containing the decree. He felt strange, not happy, not sad, but incredibly light. It was the feeling of a heavy load finally being unhitched from his shoulders. He walked toward his truck, an old pickup he had bought to replace the luxury sedan. He was driving back to Maine tonight. The Atlantic was waiting. "Mark?" The voice was thin, broken. He paused, his hand on the door handle. Sarah was standing near the bottom of the steps. She looked aged. The stress had etched lines into her face that no amount of expensive cream could hide. She wasn't wearing an umbrella, despite the drizzle. Mark turned slowly. He looked at her. Really looked at her, for the first time since the kitchen. He didn't see a monster. He didn't see a villain. He saw a stranger. "I didn't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "About the other women. About what he was." Mark said nothing. The wind picked up, blowing a stray leaf across the pavement between them. "I lost everything, Mark," she continued, taking a hesitant step forward. "My friends, my reputation, my health. I have nothing left." She looked at him with wet, pleading eyes. "You won. Are you happy?" Mark looked at the gray sky, then back at her. The anger he expected to feel wasn't there. There was no heat left in the ashes. "I didn't win, Sarah," Mark said quietly. His voice was calm, devoid of the bitterness she expected. "We both lost. I lost a wife. You lost yourself. Can't we?" She choked on the words. "Is there any way to fix this?" Mark opened the truck door. "You don't fix a condemned building, Sarah, you tear it down." He climbed into the cab and started the engine. He didn't look in the rearview mirror as he pulled away. He didn't need to see her standing there to know she was crying. He turned on the radio. Not the jazz they used to listen to, but a local station playing old country songs about hard work and long roads. Sarah stood alone on the sidewalk as the drizzle turned into a steady, freezing rain. She watched the taillights of his truck disappear into the city traffic. She looked down at her hand. The ring finger was bare, pale, and cold. She thought of Julian's touch, the cold metal of the speculum, the latex gloves, the calculated lies. She thought of Mark's warm hands, the hands that had built a life she deemed too boring. She realized then, with the crushing weight of absolute finality, that she had been holding a diamond in her hand for 7 years. And because it didn't sparkle enough in the dark, she had traded it for a handful of broken glass. Now, looking at her bleeding palms, she knew the bleeding would never truly stop. Sarah turned her face up to the rain, letting it wash over her, but it couldn't wash her clean. She was finally free of her boredom. She was finally the main character of a dramatic story, and she had never wished more to be just a face in the crowd.